Hey all, welcome to today's video. Today we are taking a look at a SplinterNet development, and that is the rumors flying that Google News might be pulled from the EU. So I'm Richard Chapo. I'm a lawyer in San Diego, California, and I've been representing online businesses for about the past 20 years. So Google, the rumors are that it may pull its news service from the EU. It's not entirely clear what that means. Does it mean that it would be unavailable to people in the EU, or does it mean that it would no longer source any headlines from the EU? We're not entirely sure, but nonetheless, either development is really an example of the SplinterNet in action. So if you've never been to Google News, basically what it is it lists a bunch of headlines, and the headlines are all clickable links. And so if you're interested in one of the headlines, you can click it, and it takes you to the original source for that story. And people in the EU, or the regulators at least, appear not to like this, although I think it's probably more measured. They just don't like American tech companies, but we'll deal with that in a second. First, let's just talk about the SplinterNet, make sure we're on the same page. So the idea of the internet originally was that it was this utopian platform where humanity would gather and join hands and sing peace songs. But many of us thought, based on human history, that might not actually happen. Instead, the internet might be divided up by the powers that be, based primarily on government actions, laws, and regulations, but it could be on other areas as well, such as religious beliefs or tech issues or things of that sort. And sure enough, particularly in the last 5 years, we've really seen the governments come back in what I like to call the Empire Strikes Back period, and they've started marking their territory online. And what it's causing is economic platforms, businesses, companies, what have you, are sort of starting to be forced to pick where they're going to operate and where they're not going to operate. And so we see the internet effectively starting to splinter. So a company that's maybe in the US that only has 50 sales a year in the EU, well, instead of going through all the compliance costs and effort for the EU, it's just a better choice to block traffic from the EU. Now, when we're talking about a source like Google with Google News, this actually impacts the flow of important information. I mean, news is something that I think we want to share worldwide, and this would inhibit it, at least to some extent. So why is Google considering pulling the Google News service from the EU? And it's a new copyright directive that is being contemplated by the EU. And in that directive, they have included what's called a link tax. And any site that essentially links to a website for journalism or an app, whatever it is, would have to pay a tax for that link. And the goal is to basically create a fund to help fund journalism. As you know, in the U.S., newspapers and what have you are having a very difficult time surviving because that business model is antiquated, and it's difficult to make money off of it when people can go online and get instant news. Why would they wait for the morning paper to come, if you will? And so investigative journalism has been heavily and negatively impacted because, frankly, there's no money to pay the journalists. And the online newspaper model, again, is one they have a lot of problems with. Trying to figure out, how to make enough money off of those articles and what have you. And it's just not been great, so far. So he's seen a big impact. And, the media, of course, has a rather torrid reputation at this time, but investigative journalism is important. We need people keeping an eye on politicians, because if we don't have somebody doing that, the boys and girls will run amok. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, I believe, is a cliche. And, these tend to be a group of egotistical people that we just don't really want to let loose on the earth without anybody watching them. So that's what's going on there. Now, why would Google be considering pulling Google News? Well, it's not really a huge moneymaker for them. And I think it's one of those services they developed primarily just to help build the brand. But you have seen Google starting to look at a lot of its services, and particularly ideas it's contemplated in its Google Labs area, and started to really limit those. The company has certainly become a bit more lean, if you will, in regards to what it's willing to offer that isn't going to make it money versus what is. And so you've seen a lot of these services that aren't making money go by the wayside. And we're even seeing some of the big services. So Google Plus, yet again, another failed Google effort to establish a social media site, it looks like Google Plus is going to be shut down. And Google will just get out of the social media game because, quite frankly, it's gotten its butt kicked for the last decade. I mean, if you want to read something funny, if you think Google is a great company, go read the history of its efforts to establish a social media platform. It's not pretty. They could have walked outside, stacked about $500 million in cash somewhere, and just lit it on fire, and probably got the same benefit from it. So anyways, Google's looking at this and, obviously calculating what the potential taxes would be that it would have to pay, and is deciding maybe this isn't worth it. Now, the irony of all this is that the link tax for the news aggregator has been tried before in Germany, and it was an utter failure because what did the news aggregators do? They stopped sourcing any information from news sources in that country. And so if you have a headline and Google puts it on its homepage for Google News, or even just the emails it sends out, summaries on whatever subjects are being issued, well, that brings a ton of traffic to your website. And so what happened for the German news companies was they saw their traffic plummet. And so their traffic was just dying. And, the German law had a negative effect on their bottom line. And what we're seeing sometimes is regulators, particularly in the EU, quite frankly, don't know what they're doing. And they issue rules and regulations and just don't really think through how it could possibly affect, the audience that they're trying to help, perhaps in a negative manner. We saw a similar situation in Spain, and it was the same issue. The World Wide Web is in favor of the flow of information, and when you try and put limits on it, it can have a negative impact. But nonetheless, here we would see, certainly a SplinterNet event where at least, one of the biggest news sites in the world would no longer be available in the EU, or at least would no longer source information from there. So that's a major development. And what does this mean for little guys? Well, nothing directly, but if you have your own website or your app, you have to start thinking about the SplinterNet concepts and what is your target market. Where are you going to spend your money marketing? Do you need to limit it to a specific market? I mean, because if a company the size of Google, with all the resources Google has, is thinking about this issue, well, maybe you should too. Because if your sales are such that 95% come from the U.S. and 5% come from the EU, well, do you want to spend a bunch of money complying with the GDPR? What about the new e-privacy directive coming out in the EU that's going to limit email? The EU is effectively trying to isolate itself. They're trying to push American tech companies out. And while their focus is on Google and Facebook and those types of companies, well, you're going to get dragged into that. And so you need to start thinking about that now so your business isn't crippled when they pass some kind of regulation that turns out to be just a complete nightmare for you. Now, conversely, if you're in the U.S., let's say, and 95% of your sales come from the EU, well, then maybe you need to look at the situation a little differently. And, who knows, heck, maybe it's time to move to the EU because there are advantages of being actually in the continent. You wouldn't be viewed as a U.S. company. You'd be viewed as a local company, and there could be some benefits to that. So these are the kinds of issues you need to think about with the SplinterNet. And unfortunately, SplinterNet is not going to go away. If anything, I expect it's going to pick up speed, and we'll see more divisive actions by governments that will lead to stories of this type. So if you have questions or comments, go ahead and leave them below, and I'll do my best to answer them. If you enjoyed the video, give me a thumbs up. If you didn't enjoy the video, oh, look, an elephant. Feel free to subscribe to the channel. We'll be posting videos all the time on SplinterNet events, so you can kind of see how things are developing over time. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Have yourself a good one.